Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode, Do ETs Have a Sense of Humor? And the answer, of course, is yes, they do. I found quite a few cases. One of you out there actually suggested this topic to me. I thought it was a great idea. I've been asked this question many times, so I really wanted to explore it more in depth. And I did. I found a bunch of cases where ETs do express humor. Laughing, having fun, finding things funny. So I think this will be quite an interesting episode. And I've certainly not heard a lot about this. In fact, just recently, I interviewed a gentleman from Canada, from the Ontario area in Canada. I'll call him Carter. That's not his real name. He does not want his real name used. I will be talking about his case in more depth in the future, but I'd like to give you a little preview here because it involves this topic of humor. One day, Carter, who was just a teenager, was walking across a bridge and looking down over the side at a parking lot 100 feet away, saw a little gray ET. And it really quite startled him. And in fact, as soon as he realized what he was seeing, he kind of jerked and went, "Oh my gosh, look!" And what was really funny is this gray was looking right at him and sort of mimicked him in a very playful, funny way, jerked the same way, as if the gray was frightened to see him as well. And that really caught Carter's attention and made him lean forward and stare even harder at this little gray. And at that moment, the gray did exactly the same movements. So this kind of made Carter laugh. It was clear to him that the gray was kind of playing with him in a very fun, sort of humorous way. And he said it removed all the fear. It made the gray seem very much human to him. So this is an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. There are a lot of cases like this where ETs do express a sense of humor. So I'd like to take you on a little journey through time, quoting some various contactees and quoting various cases, starting with the earliest to the latest, coming from all over the world really. And we can see for ourselves that ETs do in fact have a sense of humor and express emotions in a wide variety of ways. So let's just get started. I'd like to start with a quote from UFO contactee Judy Carroll. I'll just quote her directly. She sort of channels ETs, and one of her ETs goes by the name of Maris. So this is Judy talking here, and I quote, "Speaking of ETs and their sense of humor, I thought I'd share a joke one of the Gray Elders told me a few years ago. Helene and I were running a contactee group at the time, and people had questions they wanted answered. So we suggested they write them down so I could sit quietly to allow Maris to communicate the answers to me. Neither Maris nor I enjoy voice channeling, as the Greys don't communicate verbally, being telepathic, so writing is our preferred medium. One of the questions was very complex, to do with galactic warfare or some such thing, and as I sat at the computer I was thinking to myself, oh boy, this one's a bit of a worry. I'm just not into all that Star Wars stuff. Next thing, I became aware of Maris standing beside me and I could pick up on his amusement. He asked, 'What do you reckon is a real worry?' Knowing that there was a joke in the air, I responded with, 'I don't know, Maris. Tell me.' Back came his answer, quick as a flash. 'Being taken on board an ET ship and finding a copy of An Idiot's Guide to the Universe open on the control console.' Needless to say, I totally cracked up. It took me about 5 minutes to stop laughing enough to get on with answering the questions. I love gray humor. So that's one unusual example, but there are many. Here's another contactee I'd like to quote directly. This is just a short quote from Jackie Alcyon, and as she says, "I'm going to be clear. These ETs that are in my life have not hurt me. They might appear intimidating, but they actually have a sense of humor, and do things to make me laugh. They've saved my butt a few times too. So yeah, a short quote, but here's another contactee saying that they do have a sense of humor. I talked to Whitley Strieber, and he said the same thing. They will often do things that he finds very funny. And that's true of Dolly Safran, the subject of my book, Symmetry, A True UFO Adventure. If you watch my channel, you probably know her pretty well. But she had an experience when she was with the Greys being taught by them, and a very funny thing came up. Dolly was describing an event involving what we here on Earth call the Darwin Awards. And this involved an incident where a gentleman died in a very unusual and frankly funny way. He was giving an elephant a suppository when the elephant's bowels let loose, and basically this gentleman was buried in the elephant's, there's no nice way of putting it, crap. He died, suffocated. So not only did the students that Dolly was with appreciate the grim humor of the situation, but she says so did the ETs. And I'll just quote Dolly directly here. As she says, it cracked them up. They find humor in some of the dumb things that we do, and they find it funny as hell. Humans are funny to them. They just think it's funny when you do something so stupid. They also find our emotions odd because we act like idiots sometimes, and they find it funny. And that she's had a number of funny situations with them. I mean, one time they returned her wearing a baby doll nightie as kind of a joke. She thinks it probably was a joke, but yeah, that's not what she normally wears. These were not her clothes. And there are a number of examples where they do this sort of thing to people. And another example comes from the very controversial case involving Stan Romanek. He's from Colorado. He wrote a couple of books, the first one called Messages. I know his case is controversial. I've interviewed him and his wife. I think there's probably legitimacy to it and that he was framed by the government. I don't know. You can make up your own minds about that. But he did have an example of ET humor, so I thought I would include it here. He talks about a time that he was taken, and I'll just quote him directly. I wore one of my favorite t-shirts to bed. It was one that had been given to me by my friend Mark at my bachelor party 2 years earlier, and it read, I've been abducted by aliens, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. So he was too embarrassed to really wear it outside the house, and he used it as a nightshirt instead. It was around 1:45 a.m. one evening when he woke up to hear his wife coughing next to him in bed, and he was somewhat concerned because he had just been dreaming that the gray aliens were there working on her, and he thought that maybe she had been taken. So he got out of bed and went to the bathroom, and that's when he received an incredible shock. As Stan says, as soon as I turned the bathroom light on, I noticed something unusual. It seemed that instead of wearing my novelty t-shirt, I had on a woman's red and black plaid flannel nightgown, several sizes too small. He rushed back into the bedroom and asked his wife, is this yours? Tell me, is this yours? And she looked at him, barely able to keep from laughing, and said, no, it's definitely not mine. And at this point, they both burst out laughing. This nightgown was far too small, and he actually needed his wife's help to get out of it. So I wrote about some of these types of cases of people being returned in the wrong clothes or to the wrong place even in my book, Not From Here, Volume 3. And I'm wondering if those are mistakes or if these are the ETs just being funny. Here's another example, which comes from researcher David Jacobs in his book, Secret Life. And he talks a little bit about alien humor. And I'll just quote David Jacobs directly. As he says, abductees rarely describe humor or lightheartedness in any of the aliens, although we do have one reported episode. The beings had just cut off a lock of a young girl's hair. The taller being then put the hair up to his head and showed it to the other beings. This apparently was amusing. In the main, however, abductees say that the beings do not express a sense of fun. So that's his opinion. I'm not sure I totally agree with it, but yeah, he has at least one case involving humor. And there's another gentleman I interviewed. His name is Bill Foster. He actually wrote a book about his experiences where he was taken with his wife and 2 others in the state of North Carolina. He wrote a book about his experiences called The Black Triangle Abduction. And he's had many, many experiences of being taken on board and talking with the Greys. In fact, he had so many experiences that at some point he pretty much got over his fear and was able to have long conversations with them. And he has a couple of interesting incidents involving what seems to be E.T. humor. And I'll just quote him directly. He was on board and was asking them questions. Well, they were talking about time, and the E.T. said, "He tells me that we have gone through a reasonable distance where they are certain the ship can remain in stasis. Then he tells me that they remain in stasis for the time needed to complete their work, and then they can return me to the point of contact where little time in my world has passed." And I asked him yet again, what is the stasis point? So he's talking about how they pull him out of time, basically, and then return him minutes afterwards. And as Bill Foster says, the big guy patiently tells me that it is a safe point for them and it should be immaterial to me since I cannot see outside of this room anyway. I asked him why. If we are here outside the gravity of the Earth, do we have gravity here aboard this ship? And you know, that's the closest thing I have ever seen to a laugh inside of a brain before. Apparently I said something very funny to him, unknown to me, of course, but he doesn't bother to answer that question. So I guess they must maintain their own gravity system somehow. So the Grey apparently found Bill Foster's question amusing to him about how they have gravity on board their ship. And he had another incident very similar to that where the Greys expressed amusement, and he was asking about the size of the craft because it seemed to change size each time he was on board. And he said to the Grey, "You know, I want to see more of this place. I am sick of this same room every time. How big is this place?" And as Bill says, "Now that's the first time I ever saw this Grey smile. In fact, I said it twice." Now that was an idiotic answer. He said, "It's as big as we need it to be." He had a great knack for just passing a question by as if he doesn't want to answer something. But it was clearly a question which amused the Grey. Again, a really unusual example, but there are a lot of them. And here's one that really made me laugh. This is also a very unusual example because it comes from Robert Monroe. Robert Monroe is best known for his series of 3 books about his own experiences with astral projection, with out-of-body experiences. And during one of his out-of-body experiences, he asked his spirit guide to take him to see a non-Earth entity, one that he could communicate with easily. And his spirit guide agreed, and off they went, and I'll just quote Robert Monroe directly here. As Robert Monroe says, "Somewhat to my surprise, my friend offered to lead me to one, and we set off through the darkness. In what seemed only a moment, we flashed into a space filled with stars. Just below us was what I recognized as our moon, and in the near distance, the huge blue and white marbleized globe, the Earth. I looked around. Where was this super non-human intelligence?" He says his guide told him to look behind and above. And as Robert Monroe says, I was astonished. Just 20 feet above me and stretching for what seemed to be miles was a huge circular saucer-shaped object, a typical flying saucer, as so often described, but 1,000 times larger. Much too big to credit, but as I had that thought, it shrank instantly to some 200 feet in diameter. Then a door in the bottom slid open, and a figure, a man, a very human-looking man, emerged and walked, yes, walked across to where I floated. As he approached, I recognized him. Short, round, chubby, dressed with a sort of shabby gentility, and wearing a gray top hat. His nose red and bulbous, his mouth a leering grin. He was an exact replica of the star of so many comic movies I had enjoyed in the physical when I was young, W.C. Fields. This replica, projection, hologram, whatever it was, spoke like Fields as well, with the same intonations and repetitions. He invited me aboard and showed me into what appeared as a large domed room with pictures on its walls of every comedian I had ever heard, and many more of whom I hadn't, together with thousands of scribbled jokes and cartoons. He described this all as his cargo. I framed the question in my mind, cargo? What do you mean, cargo? And, I continued, you can drop the impersonation. I can take you exactly as you are. The alleged E.T. replied, you really mean it, don't you? But I'll keep it if you don't mind. It helps me to think like a human. Or would you prefer someone else, Groucho Marx, perhaps? Monroe replied, no, stay as you are. Tell me what you are doing hanging around Earth. My boy, I'm an exporter, the E.T. replied. Robert Monroe said, I see. What do you have that we need apart from this spaceship? The E.T. replied, I must have used that term wrong. I export from here, not to, my friend. Robert said, what possible thing could we have that is valuable to you? You're obviously way ahead of our technology. You use thought communication. We have nothing you could want or need. He scratched his nose. Well, sir, it's not easy to get it, but I do. Yes, sir, I do. We don't have any, and you can't imagine how valuable something is if you don't have any. Robert Monroe asked, don't have any what? The E.T. said, I've been gathering it for ages. It used to be very rare, but there's more of it about now. Robert Monroe said, you've lost me. The E.T. replied, sometimes you need to know the civilization to understand it. That's one of the problems. I still don't see, Robert Monroe said. The E.T. replied, you humans have it, and it's very rare and valuable among the rest of the intelligent species in what you call the physical universe and elsewhere. Very rare and valuable, sir. I'm a specialist in collection. You don't understand, I see. Let me explain. Please do. It's a 1 in a million product, and you humans have it. A sense of humor, jokes, fun, the best tonic there is for overloaded mind systems. It auto-erases the tension and pressure almost every time it's used. Robert Monroe said, so, you cruise around among us looking for the newest and latest? Exactly, the E.T. replied. You humans catch sight of our collection units every now and then. You get the wrong idea. You even make UFO jokes about us. All we want to do is look and listen, nothing else, apart from the odd practical joke, just to keep in training. And now, if you'll excuse me, sir, I must be on my way. Suddenly, I found myself outside the spaceship, which was rapidly diminishing into the far distance. Now I knew that at least humans have one unique quality. So I don't know, make of that what you will. It's a bit of an outlier, like some of these cases. But now I'd like to get into the actual contact cases, the physical contact cases, starting very early in time, moving all the way up to the present day. And here's a case which occurred in St. Marin in Cornwall. This is in England, and it dates all the way back to 1910. There were 2 witnesses who saw a red object resembling a ship among the clouds, they said. And they could see, apparently through the portholes, that this object contained a large number of little dwarf-like creatures that were chattering and laughing and pointing down at the witnesses. So they were apparently having a good time. This case comes from Janet and Colin Board in their book, Modern Mysteries of Britain. So that's an unusual case for sure, but it shows ETs laughing and chattering and having a good time. Here's another case which comes from the Flying Saucer Review, and this one occurred on October 14, 1954, and the location is Shamsabad, Iran. There was one witness who saw a 5-meter wide luminous object. This was about 300 feet away, and approaching more closely, he perceived, quote, a short young man standing on a circular piece of metal in the middle of this glowing object, and this figure was looking around him and sort of searching. And so he got closer to about 60 feet from this saucer, and now he could see that this pilot was actually laughing at the terrified expression on the witness's face. So he found the person's expression funny, and at this point, suddenly this object shot straight up into the air at unbelievable speed and vanished. Here's another case which occurred in Aubagne. This is in France, Aubagne, Bouches-du-Rhône. This occurred in the end of October 1959. Miss Moulet, 45 years old, was with her 3 children and went outside to hang up her laundry. This was around dusk, and she saw this egg-shaped object descend silently and hover just above her. Through a very large triangular-shaped window in front, it was illuminated. She could see about 20 people, tall, with wavy blonde hair, light skin, wearing white suits and short sleeves. They were all human-looking, and she says they all appeared to be smiling or perhaps even laughing at her. And they were there for a good 10 minutes or so before suddenly taking off at super high speeds. So this again shows ETs with emotions or a sense of humor. Here's a very interesting case, a new one. This one occurred on November 17, 1966 in the town of Gaffney. This is in South Carolina. This is a pretty involved case. It was investigated by UFO researcher John Keel. It occurred at 4 a.m. and there were 2 witnesses, 2 police officers, Charles Hutchins and A.G. Husky. They were driving just outside of Gaffney on a street called the West Buford Street Extension. And as they came around a corner in the road, they saw this metallic object directly in front of them coming in for an apparent landing. And it stopped about 20 feet above the ground. The witnesses described it as spherical with sort of a wide, flat rim around it. They saw no lights or portholes. It was dark but reflected a dull gold color in the headlights of their police car. And they drove pretty much right up to it, got out of their cruiser to look at this thing more closely, and they estimated it was about 20 feet in diameter. Suddenly a door opened silently on the underside of this sphere. A short little ladder came down, and light came pouring out through the opening, and they couldn't see anything in the interior until suddenly this figure appears, descends the ladder, and walks slowly towards the 2 police officers until it's about 15 or 20 feet away. And as Officer Hutchins says, He didn't move stiffly. He moved just like anybody else, but kind of slow, like he was taking his time. He wasn't scared of us or anything. They said he was quite short, maybe 4 feet tall, had no helmet or headgear, but was dressed in a gold suit without any markings, no buttons, no zippers. It was just shiny, like metal, and started asking them all kinds of questions. And they asked him questions too, but he would not answer. This figure was standing in the grass, so they couldn't see his feet. And they couldn't really remember the entire conversation, but they do remember that this figure spoke perfect English. And as Officer Hutchins says, he didn't have any accent or anything. He acted like he knew exactly what he was saying and doing, and didn't make any quick moves or false moves. He just stood there. So, this figure wanted to know why Hutchins and the other officer, Husky, were dressed alike in their uniforms. His speech was very precise. He pronounced each word carefully. And finally, the officers asked this figure where he was from. And this is when the figure just laughed. So apparently the figure found this question funny or didn't want to answer it. This was a brief meeting, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. And then the figure said, "I will return in 2 days," turned and walked back into the object, which took off with a low whirring sound, rose up, and was gone. This case became pretty well known. In fact, investigators went to the site and found numerous footprints at the site where this little man had stood. Apparently he did not return like he promised, and that was the end of that case. But certainly an unusual one where again an ET is laughing. Here's another case which I found quite interesting. This took place outside of Flagstaff, Arizona in the summer of 1968 in the Mojave Desert. And this actually comes from Whitley and Ann Strieber in their book, The Communion Letters. It involves a lady and her daughter who were driving about 2 hours outside of Flagstaff when they saw strange lights in the sky, and suddenly right in front of their car there was this huge dark object with a row of lights in the middle. The next thing the lady knows, she's being pulled through the windshield of her car. She looked back to her car. Nobody was in it. She and her daughter were apparently both being taken on board. And finding herself on board, she asked about her daughter, and the ETs said that, "Don't worry, she's going to be all right." And this was telepathically, at which point the woman calmed down. She said she felt very much soothed and unusually happy. She described these beings as pretty much human-like, quite tall, about 6.5 feet tall. They were wearing robes. They had sort of silvery skin, she said, round eyes that were almost a violet blue, but she felt a real connection to them. It was like her long-lost family. She said it was almost like a homecoming. They seemed to be smiling, she says, though their mouths did not move. And she was in this room, which was about 25 feet wide, semicircular, and she said she saw what looked like screens along one wall, and they were showing various terrains, strange symbols, and other things. And there was a table in the center of the room with some chairs, and she says that some of these were facing the screens, and while another ET was at a desk area and was standing from time to time and moving things around, but did not look up. And she says 2 of them seemed to be laughing all the time. They kept saying, "Welcome, welcome," in her mind and laughing. So this was a pleasant experience for her, though initially frightening. They started talking about human origins and alien intervention on the planet Earth, and they told her that her name in their tongue was actually Shalisha. They actually told it to her many times, Shalisha Li Ekumu Ram, saying it over and over until she got it right. And they told her that these words could actually be found in Earth literature, which was true. But she said she felt much love flowing from them, and they helped her understand this name, the Earth lineages that went way back to the stars. It's an interesting case. There's quite a lot to it. They took her into another room, which apparently contained the ship's driving mechanism. And in front of her, she saw this huge crystal about 3 feet across in the middle, shaped like 2 pyramids, placed base to base. She says it appeared multifaceted and at times was totally brilliant and jewel-like. It was suspended in the air about 4 feet from the floor. And I found this part interesting. They told her to put her mind into the crystal, and as she did so, she'd be able to learn how to fly the ship. One of them telepathically actually told her how to do it. She tried and failed, but they kept encouraging and coaxing her, and she could hear them smiling. They'd say, "Go on, you can do it." And finally she got it right, and they began to move out, first above the earth and then through space. And she asked why she had to do this, and they said, "So that you can remember flying and piloting when necessary." And then they started laughing. And after this information was placed into this crystal, nothing more was needed, they said. And the experience went on for some time until finally they said it was time to return to Earth. There is much more to this case which you can read in the communion letters, but I thought it was interesting because the ETs were smiling and laughing throughout this experience, and they were also teaching her how to pilot the craft, which is certainly what Dolly Safran has reported, and also Grant Cameron in his book Sky Pilots, which is all about people who've been taught how to fly the craft. So that's another example of that. And here's another case. February 7, 1969. This took place in Pirassununga. This is in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the main witness is Tiago Machado. This is a very well-known case in Brazil, investigated by researchers Nigel Rhymes, Ned S. Martins, and Reginaldo da Silva. But it's an interesting case because people in the area saw this object on a hillside, and this awakened the main witness, Tiago Machado. He's 19 years old. So he woke up, got his binoculars, and went to see this object. And he walked up to it and got to within 30 feet of it and saw that it was a domed disc, aluminum colored. He said it was about 12 feet in diameter, 5 feet high, not very big. A door opened, and from this door, 2 humanoid figures emerged and floated to the ground. He could see 2 others inside the craft through portholes. He says these figures were short, about 4.5 feet tall, dressed in tight, silvery jumpsuits, covering them from head to toe. They were wearing transparent helmets. He said they had kind of a yellowish skin, slanted eyes, very thin lips and mouth. And they approached right up to him, about 10 or 15 feet away. And they started laughing at Tiago, apparently because he was smoking a cigarette. So they seemed to be interested in that, so he tossed this cigarette pack close to one of them, who put his hand above it, and this pack floated up into the ET's hands. And he says the ETs spoke in this weird sort of hoarse guttural sounds. And when one of the ETs in the craft called out to the witnesses, the entities walked backwards and re-entered through the door, and were halfway up into the craft when one of them pointed a tube-like device at Tiago. It emitted a bluish flame that sort of went towards him, and when it hit him, he became paralyzed. This object took off horizontally, at which point Tiago fainted. When he woke up, he had a mark where this beam had struck him, And on the ground, researchers found 3 landing leg marks. So it's an interesting case with physiological effects and landing traces. But important here is that the ETs found it very funny that he was smoking a cigarette, which I can see how that would be funny. So many cases. Here's another, which occurred in July of 1972. This occurred in New Zealand, specifically in Lower Hutt, New Zealand. A woman reported that she was awakened in her bedroom by a blue light shining in through her window and a noise like a spinning top. And she rushed to the window and saw this object, your classic flying saucer. She said it was more like an inverted soup dish and was hovering over the building next door. And on top of this object was a clear dome, and she could clearly see 2 male figures, human-looking, wearing shiny blue satin-like suits with bald heads. One appeared to be controlling the object, and the other had his back to the witness. And at this point, the figure turned towards the other ET, said something, and began laughing. So this lasted for about a minute, at which point the object shot straight up and disappeared over the Wainumata Hill. So this sighting frightened the witness, and she told nobody about it for about 5 years, but finally did step forward to tell her account. Important here is that these 2 ETs, one of them told the other something and it started laughing. So again, they do appear to have a sense of humor. Here's another case. This occurred in Llangollen, New South Wales. This is in Australia. And the date of this encounter is October 19, 1975. This occurred in the evening. One of the main investigators is Australian investigator Bill Chalker. He's written a number of books. The main witnesses are anonymous. We know them only as Mr. and Mrs. M. And they were driving to their home in Armidale, and in their 1974 Ford station wagon with their dog. Their dog was a 10 to 12 month old Samoyed. The dog was asleep in the back seat, and they were traveling along the New England Highway heading south, and after passing the town of Glen Innes, they saw this bright light rising up over a hill. And Mr. M was so startled, he said, "What the bloody hell?" And this woke up both the wife and the dog. The dog began yelping and climbed over the front seat into Mrs. M's lap and frantically tried to bury its head into her lap. As she says, the dog was going crazy. So they're looking at this object, and it's coming closer, and they can now see it's a long cigar-shaped object with a bright silvery surface like unpainted aluminum. It was about 25 to 30 meters away and quite large, about 150 feet long. It had what appeared to be short, stubby wings and a large front cockpit window, but they could see 6 other large portholes or windows in 2 rows, one above the other, going down the side of the object. This was behind the main cockpit window, and all these windows were brightly lit. They could see inside of them, and they saw 2 figures sitting down towards the front of the object in what looked like white-backed chairs. They saw 3 more figures visible from the hips up, standing close by, looking out the large cockpit window directly towards them. These figures were humanoid, and they said seemed, quote, pretty normal. They were all wearing silvery colored coveralls from the neck down. They could see all kinds of what looked like instrument panels with green, blue, and red lights blinking and pulsating. And 2 of the apparent pilots kept turning their heads and looking out towards the station wagon. Now, they said that the shortest standing figure was actually laughing and pointing at the station wagon. They believed at the antics of their dog, who was still freaking out. They said this figure looked female with shoulder-length brownish hair, and she seemed to be the one who was piloting. At any rate, these three figures seemed to be smiling, and the woman actually waved at them. And this object paced the station wagon for about 3 kilometers and was just above the ground, maybe 100 feet or so, and kept pacing their station wagon alongside the road, occasionally stopping and hovering. And the dog was still upset, but at some point they stopped the car. The guy who was driving had a movie camera with him, and he quickly took some films of this object, and at some point this object just took off, though the witnesses did get the impression that the ETs told them that they would return sometime in the future. So this lasted for about 10 or 15 minutes. The witness, Mr. M, did send his film in to get developed, and when it was returned, there was no sign of the sequence where he had filmed this object. And examining it, he saw that the film had actually been spliced. He wrote a letter of complaint to the film processor, who told them that they would not print anything obscene or detrimental, which was clearly a debunking excuse. And they later would receive calls from someone who threatened them, told them not to speak about their case. So it's unfortunate because they had apparently taken some really good film of this, and it was covered up. It's an interesting case, but what I found interesting here was that the figures inside the craft were amused by the antics of their dog. It's unusual. A lot of these cases are really quite bizarre, especially this next one, which occurred in the summer of 1976 in the Santander area of Colombia. This is in South America, and this was investigated by researcher Salvador Frixedo. And this is an unusual case. It involves a group of people who are on an old bus filled to capacity, riding up an isolated and wooded area of a mountain road at very low speed. They came around a turn in the road, and the passengers watched as about 20 short, dwarf-like beings emerged from the forest. They actually grabbed a hold of the back of the bus and would not let it move. And then at this point, some of them began pushing on the side of the bus, rocking it back and forth, until suddenly it actually overturned. This naturally freaked out the passengers, who scrambled out and watched the beings, who were apparently laughing and, they said, obviously enjoying the spectacle. And suddenly, as if obeying an unheard order, the beings quickly retreated into the forest and vanished. I don't know what to make of that case. It's very unusual. I don't know. I include it here for what it's worth. You can make up your own minds about it. Here's another very unusual case. This occurred in Ukraine, actually. The exact area is Olginskaya Zatoka, along the banks of the Dnieper River. This was at night in August of 1977. The main witness is a driver, 39 years old, and his name is Viktor Alexandrovich. He had gone fishing on the banks of the Dnieper River near the outskirts of Kyiv, and was sleeping in his boat under a tarpaulin. And in the middle of the night, someone, he says, awakened him, entered his boat, and woke him up. And he was about to defend himself, but was unable to move. And at this point, he saw the face of a strange-looking entity who began to speak telepathically and said, "Do not be afraid. There is no danger. We won't hurt you." So Victor calmed down and says that he was invited to come along with this ET. So he went outside of his boat and saw an oval or egg-shaped craft sitting along the banks of the river. a door opened up, and they went inside this craft. According to Victor, these ETs were very much human-looking, and in fact, there was a very beautiful woman, he said, on board. The only real difference was that they had pointed ears, had otherwise very much like humans. He says they smiled and possessed a sense of humor. He said that they had sort of a bronzed skin, very flat noses, and were dressed in a dull gray, tight-fitting overalls. And they took him on this little trip over the landscape and finally up into space. And he freaked out when he realized that they were far off of the Earth, which he could see quite far below him. And he started panicking and begging the ETs to take him back. The ETs calmed him down, at which point they visited, he says, a mothership. And inside this mothership, this is quite an involved case, they showed him a holographic image of their planet and also their buildings. They told him that they come from the Tau Ceti system. And it was a long involved encounter. Finally, they returned him to his boat and told him, "You have experienced much this night. I will make it so you will be able to sleep the whole day. After that, you will awake, remembering nothing, but gradually your memory will return," which is exactly what happened. He later, upon awakening, did see other boaters who were in the area, and they said that they saw many, quote, wonders and tried to approach, but they said that their boat engines stalled. So there were apparently outside witnesses to that case. But important here is that according to Victor, these ETs smiled and possessed a sense of humor. All right, here's another unusual case. This occurred on September 3rd, 1995. This comes from the UFO Experiences blogspot and involves a teacher by the name of Mark Andrews, who was woken up after midnight one evening on September 3rd, 1995, with his phone ringing. And he heard a female voice saying, "We have some students here from another planet. Would you be willing to help in their Earth orientation?" So he was clearly surprised by this, but said okay. And the voice said, "We have one standing in your driveway. Follow her." So he exited his house, and there in the driveway, he said, stood a very pretty, short, Mediterranean-looking girl. She had ornately woven hair. She was dressed in a burgundy wraparound robe. And he followed her around the side of his house, and the next thing he knew, there was this flash of light, and he found himself being pulled up into a craft well above Earth. He says this figure was very young. She was short, 5 feet tall, and looked around 17 years of age. And once on board the craft, she turned to him and said, "We are going to take a shower." And that alarmed him at first until he realized that they were actually just shining this sort of, what he believed, a disinfecting light. He did not need to take his clothes off. So this matches what other contactees have told. Betty Andreasen described something very much like that. He found this interesting because as this lady began speaking to him, it was clear that her English skills were not fully developed and she was making grammatical errors. It's a long involved case. He looked outside a porthole and could see a huge star field, and it really quite stunned him to see all these stars so brightly. They showed him various diagrams and maps and showed him asteroids and comets and stuff that were moving towards Earth, and that they were helping along with this to make sure that none of these would threaten the planet. He asked where they were from, and this lady responded, "We call our world Lelari," that's Lelari, and actually showed him a projection on a screen, and he says it looked like the Big Dipper, the constellation. So he went from one room to another and encountered a tall, blonde, and very beautiful, human-looking person. And then he was taken to a room where he had an examination performed on him. He lied down at a table, and after being examined, the ET smiled at him and said, "Your exam is finished." And he was then taken to another room, which he said had the feeling of a break room. And here's where something kind of funny happened. A very pleasant, short, human-looking man, which looked very young to him, about high school age, quickly pointed at him and began laughing and told him, "I am assigned to be your babysitter." So he apparently found this funny. Mark Andrews, the witness, was then brought up to the control room and looked through the view screen, and he talked to the guy who was apparently piloting the craft and asked him if he could. Mark Andrews asked this guy if he could speak in his own natural language, because he's very interested in language. He says when he asked that, he felt this incredible sense of compassion, and that the guy was very curious about him. He described this person as being very human-looking, but with sort of Native American facial features. And the guy did speak in his own language, which Mark said sounded almost Finnish or Latin. So at this point he did ask if he could keep a souvenir, and he did not get to keep one. He was overcome with emotions and began to cry, at which point they took him back home. And he says it was such a powerful experience, he didn't sleep at all that night, and later did report his encounter to the UFO Experiences blog spot. Okay, I just have a few more cases I'd like to report. Here's one very unusual case. I like this one because it involves a healing, and it occurred in an area we don't hear a lot about, which is China. This occurred on December 11, 1999 in the Fangshan district of Beijing. And the main witness is a headmaster, a school headmaster by the name of Cao Gong. This was investigated by a researcher by the name of Zhang Jingping. At any rate, Cao Gong reports that he had gone to bed when he was woken up by a whirring noise, and looking outside he saw a man and a woman coming into his room, and they were dressed in strange attire. They stood by the side of his bed. He first thought they were thieves or something. They were short, 5.5 feet tall. They were relatively human looking, but though their heads were a little larger and their bodies were quite thin. They were fair skinned, wearing silvery white tight-fitting clothes, which reminded him of tinfoil. And they sort of looked him up and down, and then the female ET said to the male one, "He is the one who can cure illnesses. Let's take him." So it turned out that Cao Gong was educated in medicine. And at this point, he found himself being pulled through the wall above his home and flown for quite some distance. He estimates 50 miles or so, over several cities into this large floating craft. And it was very large. And he was escorted into a small room, which reminded him of a laboratory. And in this room, there was indirect, soft lighting. The ETs were very friendly, calmed him down, and told him they wanted to use him to, well, not use him, they wanted to carry out a healing procedure and have him help to cure another person of illness. So he was in there with the room. In the room, he heard sounds of animals in another room. At any rate, the female entity left and returned with a 16 or 17-year-old Chinese girl who appeared to be seriously ill. The male entity then patted Cao Gong on the Da Zui acupoint. This is between the 7th cervical and 1st thoracic vertebrae. At this point, Cao felt a burst of warmth flowing through his body. He says it was extremely comfortable. And the male entity told him to use that same method that he had just demonstrated on this Chinese girl. And so he did. And meanwhile, they were treating her with some weird instruments. And Cao Gong, used his hands and began doing the acupressure on this sick girl. And he could immediately feel heat flowing from his hands into the girl's back. So it was very pronounced. It lasted for about 5 minutes, during which his arms became numb. And at this point, the girl woke up. She was all full of energy, was no longer sickly. And when the two entities that had taken him on board saw that this experiment, this procedure, had been successful, they began letting out, quote, peals of laughter. So they were very much happy. They then took him into another larger laboratory. He became frightened because he could still hear animals, and they were making sounds that frightened him, like they were being hurt or something. Hard to say. But the entities seemed to sense his discomfort, and so they returned him to his home. And again, the same way, they floated through the sky, over Beijing, and into his home. Returned him the same way they took him. And he later reported this whole experience to UFO researchers. It's quite unusual. But again, here's an example of ETs laughing. And there are a lot of them. Just 2 more cases I'd like to present. Here's one which occurred in New South Wales, Australia on February 18, 2009. This is a rather large area. Don't have the exact location, but this was reported to the MUFON case management system. The witness is anonymous. She had gone to take a walk with her dog, as she usually does, near the local race course, where there is a lake. And at this point she noticed a, quote, small man standing about 600 feet away from her. She didn't take much notice of him at first, but as she got closer he started to wave at her, so she walked up to this man and started making small talk about the weather. And this man asked her if she had seen any shooting stars in the night, that night. And she was quite puzzled by the question, and she looked at him with curiosity, and he started laughing as though it was some sort of inside joke. But she told him that, she regularly sees them on her nightly walks. At this point, she threw the ball for her dog to fetch, and this is when she noticed a craft, a blue-silver object, landed on the other side of this small lake. And right after she noticed this 5-foot-tall man, who looked very human, picked up the ball that the dog had brought back and threw it. And she was shocked to see this ball travel about 1,500 feet, quite farther than a normal person could throw it, easily at least. And her dog bolted after it, and she looked in shock at the small man and commented on his strength. And he laughed and thanked her. So this is an interesting interaction. They talked a little bit about dogs, and at this point, this thick fog rolled in, obscuring her dog, obscuring the craft. She started to become concerned and ran into the fog to look for her dog and found him. And she turned to see this man, but he was gone. And she went over to see where this silvery craft had been landed, and it was also gone, but she did find some crushed grass at the site. So there you go, another really unusual case involving a laughing ET. And one more case which occurred very recently, February 10, 2015, outside of Los Angeles, California. This, again, was ported to the MUFON case management system. The witness is anonymous, but he woke up to find himself not in his room. In fact, he was standing with his back against this metallic surface, but it was sort of soft and was sort of molding to his body. He says it was totally quiet. He saw a few other people there, but they seemed to be unconscious. And he realized at this point that the room was circular and dimly lit. And he started walking around. Everyone else there, other human-looking people, seemed to be asleep. He felt no fear, but was certain that he was inside some kind of craft. He doesn't remember exactly what happened. He lost consciousness for a second, but woke up and realized that he was traveling in some kind of vehicle, and looking outside, he was no longer on Earth. He appeared to be on another planet. He was in this vehicle that was floating along, and next thing he knows, he's finding himself inside of this sort of sandstone-like structure with benches and chairs. And this was the first time he saw an actual ET, which was, I believe, mostly human-looking. It's not well described. But the being began speaking to him telepathically, saying, "Be calm, everything is okay." At this point, a red ball appeared in front of him, twice the size of a tennis ball, and this ET began smiling at the witness. And the witness was fascinated because this ball was floating, and he became fixated on it. And he followed it and grabbed it and threw it against the wall, and it bounced in this slow kind of motion. And it was very enjoyable, he says, and it calmed him down. And he felt that this was actually a toy that he could play with. So he wasn't sure how long this went on, but the alien spoke to him again telepathically. And he asked him, "What are you doing?" And the ET said, telepathically, "This is our way of measuring and extracting information about your mental and telepathic abilities." He said, "The next step in your human evolution is these mental abilities." So he was basically testing him on his psychic abilities. At any rate, he looked at the witness, and at this point the witness says he got a very enlightened, positive feeling, and it made him smile, and he felt like this ET had very good intentions. And he said that the ETs that he met have affection and a feeling of humor. He felt like they were very wise, and the ET basically said that he should tell others about them and that others should know that they are here. At this point, he sort of lost consciousness, and the next thing he knows, he's waking up back in his home. Okay, those are all the cases that I found in which ETs do seem to express a sense of humor, finding things funny, laughing. There are a lot of other cases involving emotions. In fact, ETs also express love. There are many cases of contactees who felt intense love both for the ETs and from them. And I didn't include those cases here. I think that really deserves its own separate episode. But the point is, yes, ETs do have a sense of humor. They do find things funny. They're very much like us. And that is why I wanted to do this episode today, because there are many people who say, "Oh, the ETs have no sense of humor." They seem to have no emotion at all. And I think that's true in some cases, particularly when people encounter the little AI grays. But as you can see, ETs do have emotions, and they do have a sense of humor. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode today. I really enjoyed making it. Thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for answers. Keep looking for the truth. And particularly appropriate for this episode, keep having fun. Bye now.